On March 11, 2007, we were tortured very badly. And Zimbabwe got back onto the world map for torture. Australians united across all barriers got an action so that the Mugabe government agreed for people to be flown outside Zimbabwe for treatment according to the Geneva Agreement that tortured people cannot be treated in their own country. So Australia was the place where I was brought for treatment and rehabilitation. It starts. And of course, great thanks go to our families, the torture survivors, to our neighbors, to our friends, but really most of all to the health workers across all divides. Because once again, at Avenues Clinic, at Middle Park Clinic, at Sydney Private Hospital, it starts. I got the top treatment to bring me back to where I am today. Family and friends play a big role in that, but the support groups play a very big role because that is the long-term one. When Gough Whitlam won the elections in 1973, the first head of state invited to this country the following year was Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. We had big demonstrations against the Whitlam government for not articulating their support for the liberation movement. But that act of bringing Julius Nyerere here was an act number 2, because the act number 1 was to ban all sporting ties with South Africa until democracy, as soon as he won the elections, as the first action of a number that took Australia back from its past into the modern world. So Nyerere's visit, Mwalimu Nyerere's visit to Australia was extremely important because it not only brought to the household discussions on liberation, but of liberation movements in Africa, where Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and his team of liberators were crafting successfully a strategy with the top technocrats chaired by Herbert Chitepo, the chair of the liberation movements, all of them by election. They were crafting the trajectory of the liberation movement as one of the tools to mainstream the demands of Africa and Africans in the diaspora into the global politics and the global agenda. They were doing very well because the machinery was there. Through the Liberation Center in Dar es Salaam, Australians were connected directly to the liberation movements. And of course, we directly at the Free Zimbabwe Center got directly connected to represent what Nyerere saw as the fighting force ZANU in Dar es Salaam. And in doing so, we were able to set up a representative's office in Sydney, in our spare bedroom called the Free Zimbabwe Center. Through that, we were able to advocate for all liberation movements. We were able to really mainstream discussion on African liberation movements into the entire political dialogue that was taking place on struggles around the world, into the Australian daily discussion in the press, in parliament in Australia, in churches, faith-based. It just became part of that as well. I'm making this background because Zimbabwe has been the most affected by the Kissinger Plan of Action for Southern Africa, which had the objectives of retaining supremacy of the whites in Africa, and the economics were really to be retained in the hands of the whites, and retaining the political voice of the whites in Africa, as well as ensuring that the so-called extremists who were the Pan-Africanists failed, because the fear in Kissinger's books was that the African Americans would get bad ideas about their own situation in the United States of America. That struggle is still on, because I see Sydney Peace Prize last year awarded the Sydney Peace Prize to Black Lives Matter. And it was the first time that the prize was given to a collective leadership than to one person. A huge step forward for Sydney Peace Prize. Congratulations to them, and our appreciation and thanks. So the election in Zimbabwe, if you remember everything that we have been through in Australia, the cadres who were being groomed under the Nyerere Chitepo African Union strategy for mainstreaming African demands into the global agenda are these young people who have faithfully executed a peaceful replacement in a democratic trajectory of the Mugabe government with the now transitional government of Emmerson Mnangagwa, as he prepares for elections to bring democracy back on its normal trajectory. It's therefore very important for us, the Zimbabwe Information Center, for us in Zimbabwe, for the Zimbabwe Information Center to continue with its work, because it is the only institution that has got direct continuity from the old anti-apartheid days through South Africa's transition to today. Hopefully, the young Zimbabweans, the young Australians will keep the Zimbabwe Information Center work and agenda alive, for what is going on in Zimbabwe is important, not just for Zimbabwe, but for the region. And hopefully, the Zimbabwe Information Center will continue its wonderful work for Zimbabwe. Thank you.